On the blood-stained plains of Wyoming Territory, 1868, fate was about to deal Sarah Mitchell the cruelest hand imaginable. Beaten, shot, and left to die by settlers who saw her homestead as nothing but a prize to be taken, she lay broken in the shadow of her burning house. But destiny had other plans. As she closed her eyes, accepting what seemed to be her final moments, hoofbeats echoed across the prairie. Luke Hawkins, a man who'd sworn never to let another soul into his heart, was about to break his own rules. What began as a rescue would spark a love story that would become a legend of the American frontier. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across Luke Hawkins' weathered face as he guided his horse through the rolling Wyoming prairie. 3 years had passed since Appomattox, but the memories of war still haunted his every step. The crack of rifles, the screams of dying men, the weight of a Confederate captain's bars on his shoulders. All of it followed him like persistent ghosts through the frontier wilderness he now called home. His ranch, nestled in a hidden valley 20 miles from the nearest settlement, was his sanctuary. Here, among the wild grass and untamed hills, he'd built something resembling peace. The locals knew him only as the quiet rancher who traded fair and kept to himself. None knew of the nightmares that plagued his sleep, of the faces of men he'd killed in Virginia's blood-soaked fields. The sound of gunfire in the distance snapped him from his brooding. 3 shots, then silence. In these parts, gunfire usually meant hunting, but these shots carried a different weight. They were too measured, too deliberate. Luke's hand instinctively moved to the Colt at his hip, a gesture born from years of survival instinct. He'd heard whispers in town about the Blackwood settlers, led by the ruthless James Blackwood. They'd been pushing their way through the territory, claiming whatever land caught their fancy. Some said they had papers from the territorial government. Others spoke of burned homesteads and missing families. Luke had kept his distance from such matters. The war had taught him that taking sides only led to more graves. But as he urged his horse toward the source of the gunfire, something felt different. The pillar of black smoke rising against the afternoon sky stirred something in his gut he hadn't felt since the war, a mix of dread and duty that he'd sworn to leave behind. 2 Rivers, his closest friend and occasional trading partner from the nearby Shoshone camp, had warned him just last week. The white settlers bring storm clouds, the native hunter had said, his dark eyes serious. They speak with forked tongues about peace, but their hearts hunger for war. Luke had dismissed the warning then, too focused on his own isolation to concern himself with territorial disputes. But now, as he crested the hill overlooking the Mitchell homestead, he realized his days of neutrality were about to end. The sight below forced him to confront a truth he'd been avoiding. The frontier's violence wasn't so different from the battlefields he'd left behind. A small farmhouse burned fiercely, its flames reaching skyward like desperate fingers. Several bodies lay scattered across the yard, farmhands from the look of their clothes. And there, against the backdrop of destruction, he spotted movement. A woman's form, crumpled but still stirring, her dress stained dark with blood. Luke's war-trained eyes caught other details: fresh hoofprints leading west, discarded shell casings, glinting in the sun, and the deliberate pattern of the attack. This was no random act of frontier violence. This was an execution, interrupted. The woman's fate now rested in his hands. Every instinct urged him to ride on, to maintain the solitary existence he'd built so carefully. But as he watched her struggling for life below, Luke Hawkins realized some choices aren't choices at all. They're moments that define a man's soul. Sarah Mitchell tasted copper and ash as consciousness flickered like a guttering candle. The world swam in and out of focus. One moment, the blazing remnants of her home filled her vision. The next, only darkness. Her body felt distant, disconnected. as though she were floating above the blood-soaked earth where she lay. In these moments between life and death, memories floated through her mind with startling clarity. Thomas's laugh as he'd swung her around on their wedding day just 2 years ago. The pride in his eyes when they'd first stood on their homestead. The deed clutched in his calloused hands. The quiet moments at dawn when they'd planned their future. Over cups of steaming coffee, but Thomas was gone now, taken by fever last winter. She'd buried him beneath the old oak tree, the same one James Blackwood's men had used for cover when they'd attacked. They'd come at dawn, just like any other morning, except their arrival had brought gunfire instead of sunrise. "This land's marked for settlement, Mrs. Mitchell," Blackwood had declared, his shadow falling across her kitchen floor. "Your claim ain't worth the paper it's written on." When she'd shown him the deeds, properly filed and certified, he'd merely smiled. It was the kind of smile that belonged on a wolf, not a man. The beating had come first, a message they'd said to anyone else who might resist. Then the shots, when she'd still refused to sign over her land. They'd been poor marksmen, these civilized men with their fine clothes and cruel eyes. Or perhaps they'd meant to let her suffer, to die slowly as her home burned around her. Through the haze of pain, Sarah heard hoofbeats approaching. More of Blackwood's men, perhaps, coming to finish what they'd started. She tried to move, to crawl toward the cover of the burning house, but her body refused to obey. The sound grew closer, then stopped. Boots crunched on the hard-packed earth near her head. "Mom?" The voice was unfamiliar, deep, hesitant, with a hint of the South in its cadence. "Good Lord!" Rough hands, gentler than she expected, turned her carefully. Sarah forced her eyes open, meeting a gaze as storm-gray as the Wyoming sky. The stranger's face was weathered, lined with experiences she couldn't begin to guess at. But his eyes held something she hadn't seen since Thomas. "Kindness, don't..." She managed to whisper, though whether she meant "don't leave me" or "don't hurt me," she wasn't sure. The stranger's expression hardened as he took in the scene around them. His hand moved to the gun at his hip, checking the area for threats, before returning his attention to her. "I'm Luke Hawkins," he said softly. "I've got a ranch about 10 miles north. Can you hold on if I get you there?" Sarah wanted to respond, to thank him or warn him about Blackwood's men. But darkness was creeping in at the edges of her vision. The last thing she saw was Luke shrugging off his coat to wrap around her shoulders, his face set in grim determination. "Stay with me, Mum." His voice seemed to come from very far away. "I've seen enough death in this life, not adding yours to the count today." As consciousness slipped away entirely, Sarah felt herself being lifted with surprising gentleness. For the first time since the attack began, warmth returned to her cold limbs. Whether it was death's embrace or salvation's promise, she couldn't tell. But as the rhythm of hoofbeats lulled her into darkness, one thought remained. She'd survived. This long. Perhaps, just perhaps, fate wasn't finished with her yet. Luke's ranch emerged from the gathering dusk like a ship through fog. The weathered cabin sat nestled against a natural rock formation, partially hidden from view until you were nearly upon it. A clever position, Sarah thought dimly through her pain. Defensible, with clear views of the surrounding valley. The woman in his arms had drifted between consciousness and shadow during their ride, occasionally murmuring what sounded like prayers or her dead husband's name. Luke had pushed his horse as hard as he dared, all too aware of the blood seeping through his coat despite his makeshift bandages. 2 rivers. Luke's voice carried across the yard as he dismounted, somehow managing to keep Sarah steady. "Need your help here." A figure materialized from the shadows of the barn, tall, straight-backed, wearing a mixture of native dress and settler's clothing. 2 rivers took in the scene with dark, intelligent eyes that missed nothing. "The settlers." "Work," he said. It wasn't a question. "Blackwood's men," Luke confirmed, carrying Sarah toward the cabin. "They left her for dead." 2 rivers moved ahead of them, pushing open the cabin door and quickly lighting the oil lamps. The interior was sparse but meticulously maintained, a soldier's quarters more than a rancher's home. My sister is medicine woman, Two Rivers said, already moving to gather supplies from a chest near the fireplace. I learned much from her. The woman will live if infection does not take her. For the next hour, they worked together with the efficiency of men long accustomed to treating battlefield wounds. Two Rivers cleaned and dressed Sarah's injuries, with a mixture of native herbs and settlers' medicine, while Luke kept her still during the worst moments. She proved stronger than her delicate appearance suggested, barely crying out even when Two Rivers dug a bullet from her shoulder. Why did you bring her here? Two Rivers asked finally, washing blood from his hands in a basin. It will bring trouble. Luke stared into the fireplace, his expression unreadable. Same reason you taught me your sister's medicine, old friend. Some things a man can't ride past. The Shoshone warrior nodded slowly. The settlers will come looking. They leave no witnesses. Let them come. Luke's hand rested on his gun belt. This land's seen enough innocent blood. A soft moan from the bed drew their attention. Sarah's eyes fluttered open, clearer now, though glazed with pain. Her gaze darted between the two men, fear warring with necessity. You're safe, Mrs. Mitchell, Luke said, keeping his distance to avoid frightening her. This is Two Rivers. He's patched up more bullet holes in me than I care to count. Sarah, she whispered. Please, call me Sarah. Her eyes fixed on Luke. Why did you save me? Luke moved to pour her a cup of water, buying time to consider his answer. Man doesn't need a reason to do right, he said finally. But those who did this, they need a reason to do wrong. That's what makes them dangerous. They'll kill you. Too, Sarah managed, accepting the water with trembling hands. Blackwood, he wants the land. Says there's something valuable, wouldn't say what. Two Rivers and Luke exchanged glances. Gold, Two Rivers said quietly. The streams in that valley, my people have known for generations. We kept the secret, knowing what its discovery would bring. Then they didn't just want my land. Sarah's voice strengthened with anger. They murdered my ranch hands, burned everything. For gold? Greed makes monsters of men, Two Rivers said. But it also reveals warriors. He looked pointedly at Luke. You have chosen your path, my friend. I will send word to my people. They should know trouble comes. After Two Rivers departed, silence fell in the cabin. Luke busied himself preparing. A simple meal, aware of Sarah watching his every move. Finally, she spoke again, her voice small but determined. I won't be a burden. Once I'm healed, I'll find my own way. Luke turned from the stove, meeting her gaze directly. Your land's rightfully yours, Mrs. Sarah. Man's got a right to defend what's his. Woman too. He paused, choosing his next words carefully. Way I see it, you've got three choices. Run, though Blackwood's sort don't stop hunting easy. Fight, which I wouldn't advise doing alone. Or stay here, get strong, and we'll figure out what's right together. Sarah closed her eyes, exhaustion finally claiming her, but not before Luke caught the ghost of a smile. Together, she murmured. Been a long time since that word meant anything. Luke watched her drift into sleep, his hand unconsciously touching the Confederate captain's bars he kept in his desk drawer. He'd sworn off causes after the war, yet here he was, taking up another. But as he looked at Sarah's peaceful face in the firelight, he realized some battles chose you whether you went, looking for them or not. James Blackwood stood in the charred remains of the Mitchell homestead, his polished boots incongruous among the ashes. The morning sun revealed what darkness had hidden, a trail of blood leading away from where they'd left the widow, then hoofprints heading north. His second-in-command, Tucker, shifted nervously beside him. Could have been animals, boss, Tucker suggested, though his tone lacked conviction. Lot of wolves in these parts. Blackwood's hand cracked across Tucker's face. Wolves don't clean up blood trails. Wolves don't leave military-grade bandages. He held up the bloodied scrap of cloth they'd found. Someone found her, someone with training. The sound of approaching horses drew their attention. 3 riders appeared, one of them bearing the silver star of the Territorial Marshal's office. Blackwood's face arranged itself into a mask of concerned citizenship. "Marshal Reynolds," he called out. "Appreciate you coming so quick." The marshal, a lean man with hard eyes, surveyed the destruction. "Got your message about Indian raiders?" Blackwood: "Funny thing, though, my office got word from the Shoshone agent yesterday. Their bands are all accounted for 50 miles east. Perhaps you misunderstood my message." Blackwood smiled thinly. "Never said they were Shoshone. Could have been Crow, Blackfeet. Lot of hostiles in these parts. Hostiles don't usually leave. Shell casings from Army-issue Winchesters." The marshal dismounted, picking up one of the brass cylinders. "Care to explain that?" Before Blackwood could respond, one of his men came running from the barn. "Boss, found something you need to see." Behind the barn, they discovered fresh grave sites, the Mitchell ranch hands hastily buried. The marshal knelt examining the turned earth. "These men were buried with care," he observed. "Their hands were crossed, Christian burial." "Marshal," Blackwood's voice carried a subtle warning, "this territory's growing. Progress means change. Change means some folks might need persuading. Your office approved our settlement party. Your superiors understand what needs doing out here." Reynolds stood slowly, brushing dirt from his knees. "They understand legal settlement, Blackwood, legal being the key word." He mounted his horse. "I'll be watching, and if I find out the widow Mitchell's alive somewhere, well, dead folks can't sign over land deeds, can they?" After the marshal rode off, Blackwood's fake smile vanished. "Tucker, get the men together. That blood trail leads north. Only 2 ranches up that way, the Henderson place and that loner Hawkins." "Hawkins?" Tucker touched his bruised face gingerly. "Heard talk about him in town. Ex-Confederate officer. Keeps to himself, but folks say he's handy with a gun." "Confederate?" Blackwood's eyes narrowed. "Then he's got no friends in the territorial government? No legal standing?" He mounted his horse. "Gather 20 men. We'll pay Mr. Hawkins a social call." 20 men for one rancher. 20 men to send a message. Blackwood spurred his horse. "This territory's changing. Ain't got room for heroes anymore." Miles north, unaware of the approaching storm, Luke watched Sarah take her first steps since the attack. She leaned heavily on his arm, but her eyes shone with determination as she made it to the cabin's porch. "Easy now," he cautioned. 2 rivers. Said those stitches need at least a week. Can't lie about forever." She managed a small smile. "Besides, I hear Ryder coming." Luke's hand moved to his gun, but relaxed as 2 rivers appeared around the bend. The Shoshone's expression drove all. Ease from the morning. "Blackwood!" 2 rivers dismounted smoothly. 20 men riding north. They found the trail. Luke helped Sarah back inside, his mind already shifting to strategy. "How long?" 2 hours, maybe less. Sarah gripped Luke's arm. "Run, please." "I'm not worth dying for." Luke checked his rifle, then his pistol. "Nobody's dying today, Sarah." He met 2 rivers' gaze. "Remember that canyon ambush we planned for the wolf pack last winter?" 2 rivers smiled grimly. "I will gather my hunters, 6 rifles plus yours." 7, Sarah said firmly. "I can shoot. Thomas taught me." Luke saw the steel in her eyes and nodded. 7 then. Let's teach Mr. Blackwood some geography, starting with what a killing ground looks like. Dawn broke over Luke's ranch with deceptive peace. After Blackwood's men had been turned back at the canyon, a firefight that left 2 settlers dead and the rest scrambling for cover, an uneasy quiet had settled over the valley. Sarah sat on the porch, watching Luke check the perimeter, noting how he moved with the careful precision of a man who'd spent years watching his own back. "Your stitches holding?" he asked, climbing the steps to join her. 2 rivers does good work, she replied, unconsciously touching her shoulder. The pain had faded to a dull ache, but other wounds ran deeper. "I see them sometimes when I close my eyes. The men who worked my ranch, they had families." Luke settled beside her, leaving careful space between them. "War taught me something about ghosts," he said quietly. "Can't outrun them. Can't fight them. Just got to make peace with them. Let them remind you what you're fighting for." "Is that why you live out here alone?" "Was alone," he corrected, then seemed surprised by his own words. Their eyes met briefly before both looked away. Inside, the cabin had slowly transformed over the past week. Sarah's touch was evident in small ways. Wildflowers in a tin cup, a quilt she'd salvaged from her burned home draped over a chair, the smell of fresh-baked bread. Luke found himself noticing these changes, the way they made his sparse residence feel more like a home. "Tell me about Thomas," Luke said suddenly, "if you don't mind talking about him." Sarah's hands stilled in her lap. He was a good man, gentle, believed in building things, not destroying them. A sad smile touched her lips. Would have hated all this fighting. But he also believed in justice. That's why we filed all our papers properly, got everything legal and right. Fat lot of good. It did us. Law's only as good as the men enforcing it, Luke agreed. That Marshal, though, he seemed different. Marshal Reynolds. Sarah nodded. He helped us file our claim, one of the few honest men in the territory. She hesitated. "Luke, why are you really helping me?" "The truth this time." Luke was quiet, for a long moment, cleaning his rifle with methodical care. "After the war, I couldn't find a reason for anything. Wandered west, trying to forget. But maybe," he checked the rifle's action, the click sharp in the morning air. "Maybe I was just waiting to find something worth remembering." The space between them seemed to shrink, charged with unspoken words. Sarah's hand moved, hesitant, to cover his. The rough calluses of his trigger finger brushed against her palm. "2. Rivers says Blackwood's gathering more men," she said softly. "We could still leave, find somewhere new." Luke turned his hand to clasp hers, warm and solid. "You spent 2 years building a life here. Seems to me that's worth defending." His voice grew harder. "Besides, men like Blackwood, they don't stop. Give them one victory, they'll want 10 more." A rider appeared on the horizon, 2 rivers, moving fast. Luke stood, helping Sarah to her feet. Their hands lingered together a moment longer than necessary. "Whatever comes," Sarah said, "I'm glad it was you who found me that day." Luke's response was cut short by 2 rivers' arrival. The Shoshone warrior's expression was grave. "Blackwood has 50 men now. They're not just settlers. Hired guns from Colorado, Wyoming Territory marshals on his payroll. They come tomorrow at dawn." Sarah squared her shoulders. The morning, sun catching the gold in her hair. "Then we have 1 day to get ready." Luke nodded, his expression determined. 2 rivers get your hunters. Sarah, show me every detail you remember about your land. If Blackwood wants a war," he checked his dough. "Gunbelt, the gesture as natural as breathing. Well, some of us still remember how to fight one." Night fell over the ranch like a heavy blanket, bringing with it the kind of silence that made memories too loud to ignore. Luke and Sarah sat by the fireplace, studying a rough map of her land he'd drawn based on her descriptions. 2 rivers had left to gather his hunters, leaving them truly alone for the first time since her arrival. "There's something I haven't told you," Sarah said finally, her fingers tracing the map's lines. "About Thomas, about the land, about why Blackwood wants it so badly." Luke set aside the coffee he'd been drinking, giving her his full attention. The firelight cast flickering shadows across her face, highlighting the determination in her eyes. "Thomas wasn't just a farmer," she continued. "He was a geologist before the war. Studied at Harvard, worked for mining companies back east. When we came west, he wasn't just looking for farmland. He was looking for something specific. The gold." Luke nodded. 2 rivers mentioned it. Not just gold. Sarah stood, moving to her saved belongings. From a hidden pocket in her dress, she withdrew a leather-bound journal. Thomas found signs of silver, too. Rich veins, deep in the hills. He documented everything, drew maps, took samples. But he knew what would happen if word got out. Luke took the journal, handling it with care. The pages were filled with detailed drawings, mathematical calculations, and precise observations. "This is why Blackwood's so determined. Man like that, wealth isn't enough. He wants an empire. Thomas tried to protect it, filed our claim under farmland only, kept the mineral rights secret. But somehow Blackwood found out." Sarah's voice caught. "The night before, Before the attack, Thomas told me he'd seen men surveying our south ridge. He was going to ride to the territorial office, file additional papers, but he never made it. Luke finished quietly. Sarah shook her head, tears finally breaking free. They murdered him on the trail, made it look like an Indian attack. I found out later that Blackwood's men had been watching us for weeks, waiting for a chance. Her hands clenched into fists. I kept up the farm, acted like I knew nothing, but they must have realized I had Thomas's documentation. That's why they came. Luke moved without thinking, drawing her into his arms. She stiffened for a moment, then melted against him, her tears soaking into his shirt. They stood like that for a long moment, the fire crackling behind them, her grief finally finding release. "My Sarah," he murmured into her hair, then froze, realizing what he'd said. But she didn't pull away. Instead, she lifted her face to his, eyes shining with tears, and something else. Something that made his heart race like it hadn't in years. "Say it again," she whispered. "Sarah." His hand cupped her cheek, thumb gently wiping away her tears. The distance between them vanished as she rose on her tiptoes, her lips meeting his with all the desperate hope of a new beginning. The kiss was gentle at first, then deepened with shared need and understanding. When they finally parted, both breathless, Luke rested his forehead against hers. "Been trying not to do that since the first day you were strong enough to sit up," he admitted. A small laugh escaped her, the sound warming the room more than any fire could. "And here I thought you were just being gentlemanly." "Oh, I was." His smile turned serious. "Still am. Tomorrow's coming, and with it Blackwood's army. What we're facing, I need you to know you have choices. We can take 2 rivers offer, slip away through Shoshone Territory, start fresh somewhere else." Sarah's hand found his chest, resting over his heart. "My whole life, I've let others choose for me. My father chose Thomas. Thomas chose this land. Even Blackwood tried to choose my fate." She met his gaze steadily. "I'm choosing now. I'm choosing to fight. I'm choosing you." The conviction in her voice stirred something in Luke he'd thought died at Appomattox. "Then we fight," he said simply. "Together." Their second kiss held promise rather than desperation, a future worth battling for. Outside, the night grew deeper, and somewhere in the darkness their enemies gathered. But in that moment, wrapped in each other's arms, they found a strength that no army could match. The morning sun found Luke, and 2 rivers studying the valley, approaches to the ranch, marking natural choke points and defensive positions. Sarah watched from the porch, Thomas's journal clutched to her chest, as more Shoshone warriors arrived. In small groups, each one skilled with both bow and rifle, each one owing 2 rivers some debt of honor. 12 warriors now, 2 rivers reported, joining her on the porch. "Good men, strong hearts." He nodded toward Luke, who was showing a young warrior, the best rifle positions. "He is different since you came. Before he was like winter stream, frozen, still. Now he flows again." Sarah felt warmth color her cheeks. "He saved my life in more ways than one." Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of approaching horses. Luke materialized beside them, rifle ready, but relaxed slightly when he recognized Marshal Reynolds leading a small group up the trail. "Quite a gathering you've got here, Hawkins," Reynolds called out, dismounting. His eyes took in the armed Shoshone warriors with raised eyebrows. "Care to explain why you're assembling an army?" Could ask Blackwood the same question. Luke replied evenly. "Heard he's got 50 hired guns riding with him now." Reynolds spat into the dust. 63 last count, including 3 of my own deputies, who suddenly decided to take personal leave." He looked at Sarah. "Mrs. Mitchell, good to see you're not as dead as reported." "Marshal," Sarah stepped forward, offering Thomas's journal. "My husband's research, proof of what Blackwood's really after, and proof that Thomas's death wasn't any Indian raid." Reynolds leafed through the journal, his expression darkening. "This is why they burned the territorial office 2 nights ago, destroying the original claim papers." He handed the journal back. "I can't help officially, They've got too many friends in high places, but, he smiled grimly, I've got a few days' leave coming myself. Shame if I spent it visiting old friends. Luke nodded slowly. Any other old friends feeling sociable? Few ranchers from the south. Valley, folks who've had their own troubles with Blackwood's brand of progress. They'll be here by sundown. Reynolds turned to Two Rivers. Your people have no quarrel here. Could get ugly. Two Rivers straightened proudly. The quarrel is chosen, not given. My people know this land's heart. If Blackwood wins, more will come. Better to fight now, with warriors we trust. A rifle shot cracked across the valley. Everyone ducked as bullets spattered against the cabin wall. Through his scope, Luke spotted 5 riders on the ridge, Blackwood scouts, testing their defenses. Get inside, he shouted, but Sarah was already moving, not toward the cabin but to the rifle rack. She grabbed a Winchester, checking it with practiced hands. Thomas taught me more than geology, she said, taking position at a window. The firefight was brief but intense. 2 of Blackwood's men fell, while the others retreated under covering fire. When silence returned, Two Rivers investigated the fallen. Scouts, Colorado men, he reported. Hired guns, like you said. They carry this. He held up a crude map of the ranch. Luke studied it grimly. They'll come through the north draw. Only approach wide enough for their numbers. That's what they're. Meant to think, Reynolds said thoughtfully. Mrs. Mitchell, your husband's journal, did he map the old mining tunnels in these hills? Sarah's eyes widened. Yes, there's a whole network. The settlers who worked this land before, they dug for silver in the 1850s. Failed, but the tunnels remain. Many connect to Shoshone hunting caves, Two Rivers added. My people know them well. Luke looked at Sarah, seeing his own fierce hope reflected in her eyes. We're outnumbered in the open, but in those tunnels, we choose the battlefield, she finished. Thomas always said knowledge was power. Time to prove him right. As they gathered around the cabin table, plotting strategies and marking tunnel entrances on their maps, Luke watched Sarah directing the planning with calm authority. The frightened widow he'd found bleeding in the dirt was gone, replaced by a warrior in her own right. They'll come at dawn, Reynolds warned. Blackwood's got too much pride to wait longer after today's loss. Sarah's hand found Luke's under the table, squeezing once. Then let's make sure we're ready to give him a proper welcome. Afternoon's sun glinted off empty bottles lined along Luke's back fence. Sarah stood 20 paces away, Thomas's old Colt heavy in her hands. Luke positioned himself behind her, adjusting her stance with gentle touches that sent warmth through her despite the autumn chill. Breathe first, he instructed, his voice low near her ear. Sight second, squeeze third, never the other way around. Sarah inhaled slowly, feeling the ghost of Thomas's long-ago lessons overlapping with Luke's present guidance. The pistol cracked, and a bottle shattered. Then another. And another. You've done this before, Luke observed, impressed. Thomas believed. A woman should know how to protect herself. Sarah lowered the gun, turning to face him. But he never taught me the things you'll need to show me. About fighting, about killing. Luke's expression darkened. Sarah, no, she cut him off. I've seen death now. Caused it during that skirmish yesterday. I need to know how to do it right, how to live with it after. Before Luke could respond, hoofbeats announced Two Rivers' return from town. The Shoshone warrior's face carried news. Before he spoke, the bank manager Collins, Two Rivers, dismounted smoothly. He's been sending messages to Blackwood. My people saw him with a courier this morning. Damn, Luke muttered. Collins approved Thomas's original loan. He'd have known about the mineral surveys. That's how Blackwood knew. Sarah's voice shook with rage. Collins probably told him the moment Thomas filed the claim. They'd been planning this for months. Luke touched her arm gently. This changes things. Collins knows about the tunnels too. He funded the original mining operation back in '50. He's meeting Blackwood tonight, Two Rivers added, at the Silver Dollar. My hunters heard them arrange it. Sarah checked the Colt's cylinder with practiced hands. Then we go into town. Tonight. Too dangerous, Luke protested. Town's crawling with Blackwood's men. Exactly why they won't expect it. Sarah's eyes held steel. Collins has copies of Thomas's surveys. Original deeds too, probably. We need those papers. She's right, Two Rivers nodded. Documents would prove Blackwood's crimes to territorial governor. Even his friends in government couldn't ignore that. Luke studied Sarah's face, seeing the determination there. She wasn't asking permission. She was stating fact. His Sarah had emerged from her trials like a sword from fire, tempered and sharp. We do this smart, he finally said. Two Rivers, get your best hunters. We'll need cover on the rooftops. He turned to Sarah. You'll have to get Collins talking. He won't suspect you. Thinks you're dead. Oh, he'll talk. Sarah's smile held no warmth. Men like Collins love to brag, especially to dead women. The plan came together as sunset painted the valley in blood-red hues. Marshal Reynolds arrived with news that added urgency to their mission. Blackwood's men are gathering early, he reported. They'll hit the ranch before dawn. Not at it. Collins must have told them about the tunnels. Luke cursed softly. Sarah, we can still... No. She holstered the Colt with fluid grace. We need those papers more than ever now. Two Rivers hunters can rig the tunnel entrances with deadfalls while we're gone. But without proof of Collins' treachery, Blackwood wins even if we drive him off. Lady's got sand, Reynolds observed admiringly. Better watch this one, Hawkins. She'll be running the whole territory if you're not careful. Luke's laugh held equal parts pride and concern. Already does, Marshal. Already does. As darkness fell, they made final preparations. Two Rivers hunters melted into the night, taking up positions around town. Sarah dressed in clothes borrowed from the Shoshone women, practical garments that would let her move and fight if needed. Remember, Luke said softly as they prepared to ride, Collins isn't a soldier. He'll break easy if pressed. Don't let him provoke you into anything rash. Sarah checked her hidden derringer, then the knife in her boot. I won't kill him, Luke. But he's going to learn there are worse things than death. She met his concerned gaze. I learned that the day they burned my home. Luke pulled her close, kissing her with fierce intensity. Just come back to me, he whispered against her lips. Always, she promised. Then she mounted up, her figure straight and proud in the moonlight. Now, let's go remind Collins why they say hell hath no fury like a woman betrayed. The Silver Dollar Saloon crouched in the darkness, like a predator waiting to strike. Sarah adjusted her shawl, heart pounding as she slipped through the back door. The main room was thick with smoke and the murmur of voices, mostly Blackwood's men, drinking away their evening. Collins sat alone in the corner, nervous fingers drumming on a leather satchel. From her hidden position behind the bar, Sarah heard the saloon doors swing open. James Blackwood's voice cut through the din like a blade. Collins, you're late with your report. Sarah risked a glance. Blackwood wore Eastern clothes, but his eyes held the same cold calculation she remembered from the day of the attack. As he settled across from Collins, lamplight caught his face, and Sarah had to stifle a gasp. The scar along his jaw, she'd seen it before, in a photograph Thomas kept hidden in his study. A photograph of the men who'd driven his family from their Virginia mine during the war. Everything's ready, Collins was saying, opening his satchel. Original deeds, mineral surveys, all of it. Once the widow's body is found in the ranch ruins, these will prove the land's abandoned. Territory. Law. Spare me the legalities, Blackwood cut him off. Where's the rest of Mitchell's documentation? His private journals? We didn't find them in the house. Blackwood's hand shot out, grabbing Collins' collar. Those journals detail every silver vein in these hills. Mitchell's grandfather mapped them during the first strikes. That family's been sitting on a fortune for 3 generations. Sarah's mind raced. Thomas had never mentioned his grandfather, never spoken of Virginia, but she remembered his reluctance to discuss the past, the way he'd throw himself into working their Wyoming claim, as if running from something. It's a blood feud, then. Luke's whisper made her jump. He'd materialized beside her like a ghost. You're Thomas. His real name was Thomas Mitchell Thorne, wasn't it? Sarah nodded slowly. He changed it after the war. How did you— Because I was there, Luke's voice held old pain. Virginia 63, Blackwood led a Confederate patrol that seized the Thorne family mine, claimed it for the war effort. Thomas's father died defending it. And you? I was the patrol's captain. Luke's eyes met hers, heavy with guilt. I refused the orders. Blackwood had me arrested for insubordination, took command himself. By the time I escaped custody, it was too late. Sarah's hand found his in the darkness. That's why you left the war, deserted. Couldn't serve a cause that allowed men like him to prosper. His fingers tightened on hers. Sarah, I'm sorry. If I'd been stronger then— Shh, she squeezed his hand. You're making it right now. Their conversation was interrupted by raised voices. Blackwood was standing, looming over Collins. One more chance, Blackwood growled. Where are the journals? The widow must have them, Collins stammered. But she's dead. You said, then where's the body? Blackwood slammed his fist down. My men found tracks, Collins. Someone took her. Someone's been interfering with my plans for months. The raids that failed, supplies going missing, Indian attacks that were too well coordinated. His eyes narrowed. Someone who knows military strategy. Sarah felt Luke tense beside her. Blackwood's next words confirmed their fears. There's only one Confederate officer in these hills, the one who tried to stop me before. Blackwood smiled coldly. Hawkins. He has the widow. And the journals. The saloon erupted into motion. Men grabbed weapons, heading for the doors. Sarah moved to stand, but Luke held her back. Wait, he breathed. Collins still has the deeds. They watched as Collins gathered his papers with trembling hands. But before he could leave, Blackwood turned back. Oh, and Collins can't have any loose ends. The gunshot was deafening in the enclosed space. Collins crumpled, his satchel spilling documents across the floor. Sarah bit back a scream. Luke's arm around her was iron, keeping her hidden as Blackwood's boots stopped inches from their position. Burn it, Blackwood ordered. All of it. By dawn, there won't be any proof the Mitchell claim ever existed. Only when the saloon emptied did Luke release her. Sarah stumbled to Collins' body, gathering the scattered papers with shaking hands. I wanted him to pay, she whispered. But not like this. Blackwood's playing for bigger stakes than we knew. Luke helped her collect the documents. This isn't just about gold or silver anymore. This is about erasing the past. Your Thomas died trying to reclaim his family's legacy. Sarah stood, clutching the precious papers. Then we'll make sure he didn't die for nothing. Her voice hardened. Blackwood wants to erase the past. Let's make sure he doesn't live to see the future. They barely made it back to the ranch before Blackwood's men struck. The pre-dawn darkness erupted with gunfire, bullets splintering wood and shattering windows. Luke pulled Sarah down behind an overturned table as lead chewed through the cabin. Wall! They're not just shooting to scare us, Two Rivers called from his position by the window. They're herding us, keeping us from the tunnel entrance. A thunderous explosion rocked the ground. Through the chaos, Sarah heard Blackwood's voice. That's one tunnel gone, Hawkins. How many more you think you can lose? Luke exchanged grim looks with Two Rivers. They'd rigged the tunnel entrances with deadfalls, but they hadn't expected dynamite. Another explosion lit up the night, followed by the rumble of collapsing earth. Brothers, Two Rivers shouted in Shoshone. Hidden warriors opened fire from the rocks above the ranch, forcing Blackwood's men to scatter for cover. The reprieve was brief. More riders were emerging from the darkness, far more than they'd anticipated. They must have sent for reinforcements while we were in town, Luke muttered, checking his ammunition. Sarah, get to the root cellar. There's a tunnel. No. She fired through a gap in the wall, earning a cry of pain from the darkness. We run. We lose everything. The papers, the evidence, all of it. A bottle crashed through the window, flames spreading across the floor as the kerosene ignited. Two Rivers leapt to smother it with a blanket, exposing himself for just a moment. The rifle crack was deafening. Two Rivers spun, red blooming across his chest. No! Sarah scrambled to him as Luke provided covering fire. The Shoshone warriors, Breathing was ragged, but his eyes remained fierce. "The spirits are not ready for me yet," he gasped. "But we cannot stay. Too many." As if confirming his words, more explosions shook the valley. The surviving Shoshone warriors were calling out in alarm. Blackwood's men had found the hidden paths to the high ground. "Luke!" Marshal Reynolds' voice carried over the chaos. He and 3 ranchers were pinned down behind the barn. "They're working around behind us!" Sarah helped Two Rivers to a sitting position, pressing a bandage to his wound. Her mind raced, remembering Thomas's journals, the maps, the hidden depths of these hills they hadn't yet explored. "The old shaft," she said suddenly. "Thomas's grandfather's original dig before they found silver. It's not on any mining maps. They abandoned it because it was too deep, too unstable." Luke fired another shot, then turned to her. "Where?" "Under the North Ridge. The entrance is hidden in a grove of dead pines. It connects to the main tunnel network, but Blackwood won't know about it." She gripped his arm. "It's dangerous. The whole thing could collapse, but it'll get us behind their lines." Another explosion rocked the cabin. Wood cracked overhead as the roof began to give way. No choice now, Luke decided. He turned to the window, whistling a signal to Reynolds. The marshal nodded, directing his men to lay down covering fire. "Two Rivers?" Sarah helped the wounded man stand. "I can move," he assured her, though his face was drawn with pain. "My hunters will keep them busy, make them pay dearly for every step." They slipped out the back of the burning cabin as Reynolds and his men drew Blackwood's attention. The night was chaos. Gunfire, explosions, shouts of pain and rage. Sarah led them through darkness she knew only from Thomas's careful notes, praying her memory served true. The grove of dead pines loomed ahead, like skeletal fingers against the stars. Behind them, the ranch was fully ablaze now, painting the valley in hellish light. Sarah heard Blackwood screaming orders, heard the thunder of hooves as his men realized their quarry had slipped away. "Here!" She found the entrance, half collapsed, and nearly invisible in the shadows. "But Luke, if the charges they're using collapse the main tunnels, this whole section of the mountain could come down," he finished grimly. "I know." Two Rivers straightened despite his wound. "Then we must be swift, like the wind before the storm." They plunged into the darkness of the shaft as another explosion shook the earth. Sarah felt Luke's hand find hers as they descended into the mountain's depths. Behind them, their world burned. Ahead lay only darkness and uncertainty, but as the tunnel swallowed them, she squeezed Luke's hand, drawing strength from his presence. They'd lost the ranch, but they'd survived. And in surviving, they'd denied Blackwood his victory. For now, that would have to be enough. The Shoshone Medicine Lodge sat nestled in a hidden valley, sheltered by towering cliffs that blocked the bitter Wyoming wind. Two Rivers' sister, Mourning Dove, had been tending his wounds through the night, her skilled hands and ancient remedies, doing what Western medicine might have found impossible. Sarah watched from the lodge entrance as Luke conferred with the surviving warriors, their faces grave in the firelight. The attack on the ranch had cost them dearly. 3 Shoshone dead, others wounded, and their strongest defensive position lost. Yet something in Luke's bearing had changed. The weight of command sat on his shoulders like a familiar coat, one he'd put aside but never truly forgotten. He remembers now, Two Rivers spoke softly from his pallet, the man he was before, a leader of men. "Does it worry you?" Sarah asked. "Seeing the soldier return?" "No." Two Rivers smiled despite his pain. "The war chief who fights for love is stronger than one who fights for hate. You have given him this gift." Sarah felt warmth color her cheeks. These past weeks had transformed her as much as they had Luke. The grieving widow had become a fighter, yet her heart had somehow found room to heal, to love again. Luke finished his counsel and approached, his expression softening as it always did when he looked at her. "The warriors say Blackwood's men are searching the tunnel network. They don't know about this valley, but we can't stay long." "My brother needs rest," Mourning Dove interrupted, her English heavily accented but firm. The spirit journey is not complete. The spirit will have to journey faster, Two Rivers grimaced as he sat up. Blackwood will not wait. Sarah touched Luke's arm. Walk with me? They strolled to the edge of the camp, where a small stream chattered over rocks. The moon hung full and bright, painting the valley in silver. For a moment they could almost forget the danger pursuing them. I've been studying Thomas's journals, Sarah said finally. The original shaft we escaped through. It doesn't just connect to the main tunnels. It goes deeper, into older workings. His grandfather found something down there, something that scared him enough to seal the lower levels. Luke's hand found hers, warm and calloused. What kind of something? A cave system, vast and unexplored. But more importantly, a way under. Blackwood's position. If we could get enough men through... She squeezed his hand. It's dangerous. The maps show unstable ground, old support beams that could collapse at any moment. Sounds like a perfect trap, Luke mused. If we could lure Blackwood's forces into the right position. Sarah turned to face him, moonlight catching the gold in her hair. I'll understand if you don't want to risk it. We could still leave, find somewhere new. Luke's hand cupped her cheek, his touch gentle despite the gun calluses. Running never. Sat right with me, even when I deserted. Some things are worth fighting for. His eyes held hers. Some people are worth dying for. I don't want you to die for me, she whispered. I want you to live for me. He pulled her close, his kiss carrying all the promises words couldn't hold. Sarah melted into him, feeling the strength in his arms, the steady beat of his heart. When they finally parted, both breathless, the moon had shifted in the sky. Marry me, Luke said suddenly. Not after, not someday. Now, tonight. Sarah's heart stumbled. Luke, I know the timing's wrong. I know we're in danger, that tomorrow might bring death for either of us. His voice was rough with emotion. But that's exactly why it has to be now. I won't face whatever's coming without having made you my wife. Two Rivers' voice came from behind them. The Shoshone way is simple. Two hearts declaring before the spirits. No more is needed. They turned to find not just Two Rivers, but the entire camp watching them. Mourning Dove stepped forward, offering Sarah a blanket of intricate design. For the bride, she said softly, to warm two hearts as one. Sarah looked up at Luke, seeing in his eyes the same certainty she felt in her soul. Yes, she said simply. Under the moon's witness, surrounded by their unlikely family of warriors and ranchers, they spoke their vows. Two Rivers blessed them, in the way of his people, while Mourning Dove wrapped them both in the marriage blanket. Tomorrow brings war, Two Rivers intoned, but tonight brings love. The spirits smile on such a balance. Later, in the private darkness of a lodge prepared for them, Sarah traced the scars on Luke's chest. No regrets, only that I didn't find you sooner, he murmured against her hair. Outside, the wind sang through the cliffs, and somewhere in the darkness, their enemies searched. But here, in this moment, they had found their fortress, not in walls of stone or wood, but in each other's arms. Dawn painted the cliffs blood red as Luke and Sarah prepared for their expedition into the deep tunnels. Two Rivers had insisted on coming despite his wounds, saying only that the spirits demanded his presence. Marshal Reynolds and his remaining men were already scouting the tunnel entrances, watching for Blackwood's patrols. Henderson's late, Luke noted, checking his ammunition for the third time. The rancher had volunteered to bring supplies from his hidden cache, vital for their underground mission. Someone's coming, Two Rivers called softly from his lookout position, but not from Henderson's direction. They heard the horses before they saw them, a dozen riders emerging from the morning mist. At their head rode James Blackwood, and beside him, looking anywhere but at his former allies, was Henderson himself. Quite a cozy camp you've made, Blackwood called out. Henderson here was kind enough to show us the way. Seems he values his ranch more than your cause. Luke's rifle was up in an instant, but Sarah's hand on his arm stopped him. Their position was surrounded. More of Blackwood's men had appeared on the ridges above. Rifles trained on the camp. "You knew," Two Rivers said quietly to Henderson. "When I told you of the spirit's warning, you knew you would betray us." Henderson's face was a mask of shame. "He's got my family. Two Rivers. My daughter. What would you have done?" "Enough talk." Blackwood dismounted smoothly. "Mrs. Mitchell, or should I say Mrs. Hawkins, my congratulations on your wedding. Consider this my gift." He drew his pistol, aiming at Luke's heart. "Your new husband's life. All you have to do is give me the journals and show me the deep tunnels your first husband mapped so carefully." "Sarah, don't!" Luke started forward, but rifles cocked all. Around them. "You have 1 minute," Blackwood continued as if Luke hadn't spoken. "After that I start shooting. First your husband, then the Indian, then every man, woman and child in this camp. Their blood on your hands, widow." Sarah's mind raced. The journals were hidden in the medicine lodge, along with the evidence of Blackwood's crimes. A lifetime of secrets, of family legacy, of justice for Thomas, all balanced against the lives before her. "If I go with you," she said carefully, "you'll let them live." "Sarah, no." Luke's voice held desperation she'd never heard before. "On my honor as a gentleman." Blackwood smiled coldly. "They can even keep the journals. Once I have the silver veins, papers mean nothing." Two Rivers stepped forward despite his wounds. "The spirits say." A rifle shot cracked out. Two Rivers staggered, fresh blood blooming on his bandages. "Time's up," Blackwood stated flatly. "Choose." Sarah met Luke's eyes, trying to convey everything she couldn't say. Their wedding night's whispered promises, their shared dreams of justice, her plan. She poured it all into that one look. "I'll show you," she said to Blackwood. Just don't hurt anyone else." Blackwood's men moved in, rough hands grabbing her arms. As they pulled her toward the horses, she heard Luke's voice, raw with emotion. "I'll find you." "I know," she whispered, too softly for any but herself to hear. Then, louder, making sure Blackwood could hear, "The deep tunnel entrance is in the north cliff face, behind the dead pine grove." She saw understanding flash in Luke's eyes, even as Blackwood's men tied her hands. "The north tunnel, the unstable one, the perfect trap." If only Luke could understand her message. "Mount up," Blackwood ordered. "Mrs. Hawkins and I have a date with destiny." As they rode away, Sarah caught one last glimpse of the camp. Luke stood frozen, his face a mask of fury and grief. Two Rivers leaned heavily on his rifle, but his eyes held something else, understanding. They knew, they had to know, because if they didn't, everything she was about to do would be for nothing. The medicine lodge had grown quiet, save for Two Rivers' labored breathing. Luke paced like a caged wolf, his mind racing over Sarah's final words. The north tunnel, the unstable one. There had to be more to her plan. She knew. Two Rivers spoke suddenly. When she spoke of the north tunnel, her eyes, they held warrior's cunning. Luke stopped pacing. "The journals, she never showed them to anyone but me. Never even told Henderson they existed." He moved to the hidden bundle beneath Mourning Dove's sleeping pallet, withdrawing Thomas's weather-worn books. As he opened the latest volume, a yellowed envelope fell out. The paper was old, the ink faded, but the handwriting was eerily familiar. Luke's hands shook as he read the letter's heading. "To my son Thomas, to be opened upon my death, from Captain James Thorne, 1863. "What is it?" Two Rivers asked, seeing Luke's face grow pale. "It's impossible," Luke whispered. He read aloud, "My dearest son, if you're reading this, then Blackwood's treachery has finally claimed my life. But there's more you must know. The silver in our mines was never the true treasure. In the deepest tunnel, where the old workings meet the natural caves, we found something else. Something that made Blackwood turn against his own country, his own commanding officer." Luke's voice trailed off as he scanned the rest of the letter. "Dear God, that's why Blackwood had me arrested when I refused his orders. The silver was just a cover story. What did they find? Two Rivers struggled to sit up straighter. Gold, more gold than the Comstock lode, but not in veins, in bars. Spanish gold, centuries old, a forgotten treasury, hidden in the caves by conquistadors. Luke's mind raced. Thomas's grandfather found it during the initial mining operation. Kept it secret, knowing what its discovery would mean for the territory. The spirits have whispered of such treasures. Two Rivers nodded. Lost Spanish gold, cursed by greed and blood. Luke continued reading. I entrust this secret to you. Son, the gold remains where we found it, untouched. I've sealed the lower tunnels. Better it stay buried than spark the bloodshed its discovery would bring. The only map to its location is encoded in my mining surveys. Surveys that appear to show only silver deposits. Sarah knew, Luke realized. That's why she was so insistent about the North Tunnel. It's not just unstable, it's the only way to reach the Spanish gold. He grabbed his rifle, checking the load, and she's leading Blackwood right to it. To trap him, Two Rivers understood. In the deep dark, where his numbers mean nothing. A commotion outside drew their attention. Marshal Reynolds burst into the lodge. Luke! Henderson's dead! Found him in the creek with his throat cut, but not before he got a message to us. He held out a blood-stained paper. Blackwood's not working alone. He's got backing from California. Mining interests, an entire private army waiting at the territory line. Once he secures the mines, they're moving in to take the whole valley. Luke crushed the letter in his fist. Then we're out of time. Sarah's not just facing Blackwood. She's facing an invasion force. He turned to Two Rivers. Can your warriors be ready to move in an hour? We are already ready. The wounded man smiled grimly. The spirits told us this morning would bring war. Marshal, Luke's voice carried the authority of his old command days. Get your men. We're going to need every gun. As the lodge erupted into activity, Luke studied Thomas's last journal entry. A simple sketch showed the lower tunnel system, with one notation that now made terrible sense. The worthy shall find glory in the depths, but the greedy shall find only darkness. Hold on, Sarah, he whispered. Your husband's coming, both of them. The abandoned mining camp Blackwood had claimed as his base sprawled across the valley floor like an iron scar. Sarah watched from her guarded tent as men moved in disciplined patterns that spoke of military training. These weren't just hired guns. They were soldiers in all but name. Impressive, isn't it? Blackwood appeared at her shoulder. 50 more men arriving tonight. The California Mining Coalition believes in being thorough. All this for silver? Sarah kept her voice carefully neutral. Blackwood's laugh held no humor. Come now, Mrs. Hawkins. We both know Thomas's grandfather left more than silver in those hills. The Spanish gold is just the beginning. Once we control the territory's mineral rights, we'll own everything from here to the Montana border. Sarah turned to face him, letting him see only what she wanted. A woman desperate to survive. And what's my role in your grand vision? Smart. Woman, he smiled coldly. The tunnels are a maze. We need your husband's surveys to find the main cache. After that, he shrugged, accidents happen in unstable mines. Miles away, in the hidden valley, Luke outlined their strategy to a gathered war council. Two Rivers sat propped against a lodgepole, his wound finally starting to heal. Marshal Reynolds and his remaining deputies checked weapons while Shoshone warriors painted their faces for battle. The North Tunnel splits 3 ways. Luke traced the path on Thomas's map. Main shaft continues to the Spanish gold chamber. Eastern fork leads to natural caves, our escape route if needed. Western fork's the key. He pointed to a heavily annotated section. Support beams here are rotted. One good explosion would bring down half the mountain. How many men can we move through the caves? Reynolds asked. Two Rivers hunters know paths through the cliff face. They can position 20 men above the main chamber. We'll take another 30 through the eastern caves. Luke's finger moved to the valley approach. That leaves your deputies, Marshal, to handle what's coming from California. My men are spread thin watching the territory roads, Reynolds warned. But we've sent riders to every ranch within 50 miles. Any folk who've suffered under Blackwood will come. Two Rivers spoke softly. More than ranchers will come. My people remember the old treaties, broken by men like Blackwood. When the signal fires burn, warriors will ride from 3 tribes. Signal fires? Luke asked. Already lit, Two Rivers smiled. The spirits are not the only ones who can prepare for war. Back in the mining camp, Sarah waited until darkness fell before making her move. The guard outside her tent was careless, more focused on his bottle than his duty. She slipped past him easily, using skills Luke had taught her during their brief time together. The camp's command tent stood dark and empty. Inside, she found what she sought: Blackwood's correspondence. With his California backers, letters, contracts, evidence of bribes paid to territorial officials. Most importantly, a detailed plan for the military occupation of the entire region, all under the guise of mining operations. As she photographed the documents with Thomas's old camera, Sarah heard movement outside. She quickly replaced everything, ducking behind a map table just as Blackwood entered with his lieutenants. "Latest report from California," one man said. "The main force crosses the territory line at dawn. 200 men, fully armed. Perfect timing." Blackwood spread a map across the table Sarah hid behind. "By then, we'll have the Spanish gold. Secured. No one will question our authority when we're backed by that kind of wealth." "The woman?" another voice asked. "She suspects anything?" "She's terrified and alone," Blackwood laughed. "By the time she realizes her precious Luke is walking into a trap, it'll be too late." Sarah's blood ran cold. Somehow they knew about Luke's planned approach through the caves. But how? The answer came with the next man who entered the tent, Henderson's son, Timothy, who'd been serving as a scout for Luke's forces. The betrayal, it seemed, ran in the family. Sarah forced herself to remain still, memorizing every detail of their planning. When she finally made it back to her tent, her guard was still drunk, never knowing she'd left. Sitting in the darkness, she touched the wedding ring Luke had given her just days ago. Tomorrow would bring blood and death, but tonight she was her father-in-law's daughter, her first husband's widow, and her new husband's wife. 3 generations of strong hearts, bound together by love of the land and hunger for justice. "Come. Dawn," she whispered to the night. "We'll show them what that's worth." The hours before dawn brought an eerie calm to the mining camp. Sarah watched torches moving in the darkness as Blackwood's men prepared for their tunnel expedition. She'd managed to slip a warning to one of Two Rivers' scouts, a young boy who'd crept close to the camp selling trinkets. Timothy Henderson's betrayal would no longer catch Luke unaware. In her tent, she laid out what she'd need: Thomas's maps, showing the true paths through the tunnels, the small derringer hidden in her boot, and most importantly, the knowledge. In her mind of what lay in the deepest chambers, the Spanish gold was real enough, but Thomas's grandfather had left something else in those depths, something only a geologist would understand. "Time to go, Mrs. Hawkins," Blackwood's voice carried false courtesy. "Your last chance to make this easy on yourself." Sarah emerged into the pre-dawn darkness, her face composed. "The tunnels are treacherous, Mr. Blackwood. One wrong turn could trap us all. That's why you're leading the way." His smile didn't reach his eyes. Along with some insurance, he gestured to where Timothy Henderson stood, looking anywhere but at her. "Young Timothy here knows the caves almost as well as you. Any attempt to mislead us—" "I understand," Sarah said quietly. And she did. Timothy wasn't just a traitor, he was a hostage to his father's debt. The fear in his young eyes told her everything. Miles away, Luke led his force through the eastern cave system. Two Rivers warriors moved like shadows, their moccasins silent on the stone. Marshal Reynolds and his men followed, then the ranchers, who'd answered his call, men who'd lost land or loved ones to Blackwood's ambitions. "Signal from the scouts," Two Rivers whispered. "Sarah got word to us. Timothy Henderson betrayed our plan." Luke nodded grimly. "Then we changed the plan. The boy's likely a hostage. His father's death weighs on him. He turned to the gathered men. New approach. We split here. Marshal, take your men through the lower tunnel. 2 rivers. Your warriors know where to position above. I'll lead the ranchers through the middle path. And the California force? Reynolds asked. My riders bring word. 2 rivers smiled. 3. Tribes gather in the high valley. When Blackwood's reinforcements come through the pass, they'll find warriors waiting. Luke checked his pocket watch in the lantern light. 1 hour to dawn. Get into position, but hold your fire until my signal. He looked at each man in turn. Today, we're not just fighting for land or gold. We're fighting for every family that wants to build a life here, for every tribe that calls these hills home, for a future not controlled by men like Blackwood. For Sarah, 2 rivers added softly. For Sarah, Luke agreed, his voice rough with emotion. In the mining camp, final preparations were underway. Blackwood had selected 30 men for the tunnel expedition, leaving the rest to guard the approaches. Sarah noted their positions carefully as she was led toward the north tunnel entrance. Last chance, Blackwood. Sarah turned to face him at the tunnel mouth. You've seen these maps. You know the risks. Is Spanish gold worth dying for? For a moment, something like doubt crossed Blackwood's face. Then it hardened into familiar cruelty. Your father-in-law asked me the same thing in Virginia, before I killed him. He checked his pistol with deliberate care. Gold, silver, land. They're not just wealth, Mrs. Hawkins. They're power. The power to shape a nation. And that's worth any price. She thought of Timothy, of Henderson, of all the lives Blackwood had destroyed in his pursuit of empire. That's worth every price. He gestured toward the dark tunnel with his gun. After you. Sarah took a last look at the lightening sky. Somewhere out there, Luke was moving into position. 2 rivers warriors were readying their ambush. A territories worth of settlers and tribes were gathering to oppose Blackwood's vision of the future. You know what Thomas's grandfather wrote in his last letter? She said conversationally as she led them into the darkness. About men who seek power in these hills. Enlighten me. Blackwood's voice dripped sarcasm. Sarah lit the lead lantern, its light barely penetrating the thick darkness ahead. The worthy shall find glory in the depths, she quoted, but the greedy shall find only darkness. Behind her, 30 armed men laughed at what they thought was an empty threat, but Sarah knew what they didn't. About the unstable geology, about Thomas's carefully hidden explosives, about the trap that had been waiting 60 years for this moment. Dawn was coming, and with it, a reckoning generations in the making. The tunnels swallowed them like a living thing, darkness pressing in, despite their lanterns. Sarah led Blackwood's men deeper into the mountain's heart, counting her steps, remembering Thomas's careful markings. Behind her, boots scuffed on stone, and voices echoed unnaturally. 30 men, all following her into the depths where Thomas's grandfather had left more than just Spanish gold. Next junction ahead, Timothy Henderson called out, his young voice tight with strain. Main chambers. Through the western fork? The boy's right, Sarah confirmed, letting fear color her voice. But the support beams there, they're not stable. Blackwood's laugh bounced off the stone walls. Nice try, Mrs. Hawkins, but we've brought our own mining engineer, Mr. Chen. A slight Chinese man stepped forward, his eyes sharp behind wire-rimmed glasses. Support structure is adequate. New beams were added recently. Sarah's heart jumped. She hadn't counted on professional expertise. But then she saw Chen's eyes flick meaningfully toward the eastern passage, and she understood. Not everyone in Blackwood's employ was loyal to his cause. The eastern path, then, she said, as if defeated. It's longer but safer. Western fork, Blackwood ordered. Now. They'd gone perhaps 50 yards when the first shot rang out, the sound deafening in the confined space. One of Blackwood's men fell, a bullet finding him from a side tunnel. None of them had noticed. More shots followed as Luke's ranchers opened fire from hidden positions. Ambush! Blackwood grabbed Sarah, using her as a shield. Push forward! Get to the main chamber! The tunnel erupted into chaos. Gun smoke filled the confined space, making the lantern light dance crazily across the walls. Sarah heard Luke's voice calling orders, saw muzzle flashes from multiple directions. Two Rivers warriors had done their work well, positioning shooters in the honeycomb of smaller tunnels. "The support beams!" Chen shouted suddenly. "Look at the rocks!" Bullets had chipped away at the stone walls, revealing what Sarah had known was there, dozens of sticks of dynamite, carefully mortared into the rock and painted over. Thomas's grandfather's insurance policy, finally exposed. "You led us into a trap," Blackwood snarled, pressing his gun to Sarah's head. "You led yourself," she answered. "Just like in Virginia, your greed blinds you to everything else." More shots rang out, closer now. Luke's voice carried through the smoke. "Sarah!" "Here!" she called back, then drove her elbow into Blackwood's solar plexus. As he doubled over, she twisted free, diving for cover as bullets crisscrossed the tunnel. Timothy Henderson seized his chance, tackling one of Blackwood's men who had drawn a bead on Sarah. "Run!" he shouted to her. "The main chamber! Luke's!" "Waiting!" Sarah scrambled through the chaos, hearing Blackwood's enraged orders behind her. The tunnel opened suddenly into an enormous natural cavern, dimly lit by lanterns. Here, the Spanish gold lay stacked in neat rows, bars gleaming dully in the weak light, but Sarah's eyes were drawn to the figure standing among them, Luke. They collided in the center of the chamber, his arms wrapping around her as bullets sparked off the rocks around them. "Had to make it difficult, didn't you?" he murmured into her hair. "Runs in the family." She managed to smile. "The dynamite, too. Rivers warriors are setting the charges. We just need to—" "How touching!" Blackwood's voice cut through the cavern. He emerged from the tunnel mouth, Timothy Henderson held at gunpoint. Behind him, more of his men poured in, taking positions around the chamber. The happy couple, reunited at last. Luke pushed Sarah behind him, his rifle trained on Blackwood. "It's over. The California force walked into a tribal ambush. Marshal Reynolds has your camp surrounded. Let the boy go." "Over?" Blackwood laughed. "Look around you, Captain Hawkins. Look at what your precious honor cost you in Virginia. All this could have been yours, too, if you just followed orders. There was no honor in what you did to the Thorns." Luke's voice was steel. "Just like there's no honor in what you're doing now. Honor doesn't build empires." Blackwood's gun pressed harder against Timothy's head. "Drop your weapons, both of you, or the boy dies like his father." Sarah touched Luke's arm. "Do it," she whispered. "Trust me." Slowly, they laid their guns down. Around the chamber, Sarah saw other figures moving in the shadows. Two Rivers warriors, waiting for their moment. She counted seconds in her head, remembering the timing Thomas had calculated so carefully. "Search them," Blackwood ordered. His men moved forward, rough hands finding Sarah's hidden derringer, Luke's backup pistol. "The gold is yours," Sarah said carefully, drawing Blackwood's attention. "You've won. Just let us go." "Oh, I'll let you go," Blackwood smiled coldly. "Right into the deepest shaft, along with young Timothy here. After all, dead families tell no tales." "You're right about one thing," Sarah met his eyes. "Dead men tell no tales. Like Thomas's grandfather. Did you never wonder why he sealed these tunnels? Why he left all this gold untouched?" Something in her tone made Blackwood hesitate. Behind him, Chen's eyes widened in sudden understanding. "Sir, the geological surveys. The water table." The first explosion cut him off, then another, and another. The carefully hidden charges detonated in sequence, exactly as Thomas had planned. The chamber shook as 60 years of preparation came to fruition. "The gold was never the treasure," Sarah shouted over the chaos. "The real wealth was silver in the higher mines. This was all a trap, waiting for someone greedy enough to spring it." Water burst through the weakened walls. An underground river, diverted decades ago, now reclaiming its course. Two Rivers warriors emerged from hiding, grabbing Timothy and firing at Blackwood's confused men. The whole chamber's rigged to flood. Luke grabbed Sarah's hand. Move! Blackwood's scream of rage cut through the thunder of rushing water. His gun came up, seeking Sarah's heart. Luke dove for their discarded weapons as Sarah pulled Timothy toward the exit tunnel. 3 shots rang out almost as one. Blackwood staggered, blood blooming on his chest from Luke's bullet. But his own shot had gone wide, because Timothy Henderson had thrown himself into the bullet's path. No! Sarah caught the boy as he fell. Luke's arms were around them both, dragging them towards safety as the chamber filled with water and screaming men. Get them out! 2 rivers appeared through the chaos, his rifle covering their retreat. The charges are all lit, they half-carried. Timothy through the tunnels as the mountains shook around them. Behind them, the roar of water grew louder. Sarah heard Blackwood's last cry of defiance, cut off suddenly as the flood took him. The tunnel mouth appeared ahead, dawn light spearing through the darkness. They burst out into morning air, just as the final charges blew, the mountains settling with a ground-shaking finality that sealed the Spanish gold forever. Marshal Reynolds and his men were waiting, along with 2 Rivers warriors, and what looked like half the territory's settlers. On a distant ridge, hundreds of tribal warriors sat their horses, watching as Blackwood's remaining men surrendered. Timothy! Sarah knelt beside the boy, who was pale but conscious. Why? Had to make it right, he whispered. What Pa did, what I did, had to make it right. You did, son. Luke squeezed his shoulder. You did. 2 Rivers' sister was already there, her skilled hands moving over Timothy's wound. He will live, she announced. The spirits are not finished with this one. Sarah stood in Luke's arms as the sun rose fully over the valley. Behind them, the mountain had swallowed Blackwood and his golden dream forever. Ahead, the territory lay open and free, its future waiting to be written. What now? She asked softly. Luke's arms tightened around her. Now, we build something worth having, something honest, grown from the land itself. Together, together, he promised. Always together. Around them, settlers and warriors alike began the work of healing their wounded land. And somewhere, Sarah thought she felt Thomas smile, knowing his grandfather's long vigil was finally over, and the treasure he'd protected had served its final purpose. Not the gold that bred greed, but the land itself, and the people who would now be free to make it their home. 1 year later, Sarah stood on the porch of the rebuilt ranch house, watching the Wyoming sunset paint the valley in gold. The land had healed quickly after Blackwood's defeat. Nature had a way of reclaiming what was hers, covering old scars. With new growth, Luke's strong arms slipped around her waist, his hand resting gently on her swelling belly. Their child would be born when the spring flowers bloomed, into a world very different from the one they'd fought to change. Timothy's letter came, she said, leaning back against him. The territorial governor has approved his application to study geology at Harvard. Thomas would have liked that. He's a good kid, Luke agreed. Found his own way to honor both his fathers, the one he lost and the one he failed. Below the house, 2 rivers rode up the trail, now well worn from regular travel. The Shoshone leader had refused to move his people to the reservation, and with Marshal Reynolds' support, they'd secured legal rights to their ancestral hunting grounds. The peace that followed had transformed the territory. The settlers from California arrived tomorrow, 2 Rivers called out as he dismounted. Good families, from what my scouts report. Looking to farm, not mine. Sarah smiled. The Spanish gold remained buried, sealed forever in its flooded tomb. But the silver mines, worked properly and fairly, had brought enough prosperity to share. The territory was growing now, not through force, but through the slow, honest work of people who loved the land. Hard to believe it's been a year, she mused. Sometimes I still expect to wake up back in that burning house. Luke's arms tightened around her. You did wake up. We both did. To something better than we'd dreamed. 2 Rivers had brought his family's wedding gift, a cradle of carved wood decorated with symbols of protection and hope. As Sarah ran her fingers over the smooth timber, she felt the future stirring. not just in her womb, but in the very air around them. The valley stretched out below, dotted with new homesteads and native settlements existing side by side. The railroad would come soon, bringing more changes. But the foundation they'd laid, of justice, of respect for the land and its first peoples, of cooperation instead of conquest, would endure. Thomas's grandfather was right, Sarah said softly. The real treasure was never gold or silver. It was this. She gestured to the thriving valley. The chance to build something true. Something worth fighting for, Luke added. Something worth living for, Two Rivers corrected with a smile. As darkness settled over the land they'd fought to protect, Sarah felt peace in her heart. She carried 3 generations of dreams now. Thomas's grandfather's wisdom, Thomas's love of the land, and Luke's fierce devotion to justice. Their child would carry those dreams forward, along with new ones yet to be born. The mountain kept its secrets, the land yielded its bounty, and love, like the territory itself, continued to grow wild and free.